El Salvador is under state of emergency after a deadly weekend of gang violence. 14 people murdered on Friday and 62 the following day, making Saturday one of the deadliest days in 30 years.
In just 72 hours, 87 people were killed, and El Salvador fell into a state of emergency. What came next was a historic crackdown that locked up 1% of the population.
In El Salvador, around 74,000 alleged gang members were arrested under the emergency regime imposed by President Nayib Bukele.
Even the U.S. took notice, sending deportees to El Salvador's mega prison. But how did a country once ruled by gangs pull off such a drastic transformation? And at what cost? The weekend that broke El Salvador. It wasn't just another weekend. It was the spark that set the whole country on edge. In just 72 hours in March 2022, 87 people lost their lives, and something in El Salvador snapped. Between March 25th and 27th, violence swept through cities like San Salvador, Santa Ana, and Soyapango. One by one, lives were taken, and families woke up to sirens, not knowing who would be next. Authorities quickly realized this was a coordinated surge. Two of the country's most feared gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, were sending a message and daring the government to respond. It was bold, calculated, and deeply personal. El Salvador, already exhausted from years of tension, hit a breaking point. It felt like a full-on challenge to the very system meant to keep the people safe. Panic set in as streets emptied and shops were locked up. Families gathered around radios, TVs, and phones, desperate for news. Police tape sealed off neighborhoods that had turned into crime scenes overnight. Inside the presidential palace, Nayib Bukele was quick to act as he wasn't about to let this go unanswered. On March 27th, he addressed Congress with a demand to grant emergency powers and back it up with action. And Congress delivered. Within hours, a nationwide state of emergency was declared. Legal protections were put on pause, and arrests began immediately. Police and military units fanned out across known gang hotspots. Homes were raided, and gang members were detained, sometimes for tattoos, sometimes for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. By mid-April, arrests had passed tens of thousands. But to really understand how El Salvador reached this tipping point, we need to go back, not just to the start of the violence, but to the history that built it. How El Salvador became a breeding ground for gangs. In 1979, El Salvador exploded into civil war. For 12 years, soldiers and rebels turned homes into war zones and streets into front lines. Over 1 million people fled, many with nothing but fear in their pockets and hope clutched tight. Thousands ended up in Los Angeles with families scattering in tough neighborhoods, trying to stay invisible while rebuilding from scratch. But invisibility isn't easy when you're poor, foreign, and young. Salvadoran teens quickly learned that fitting in could be dangerous, and standing out could be worse. So they formed their own groups, not to cause trouble, but to stay alive. Out of this survival instinct came Mara Salvatrucha, otherwise known as MS-13. Not long after, Salvadorans joined ranks with the already established Barrio 18. At first, these groups looked like street shields with tight-knit circles of kids who just wanted to protect each other. But as time passed, things switched. By the late 80s, the streets of Los Angeles were shifting, and gangs weren't about defense anymore. Then crept in drugs, extortion, and violence. Then came the law that changed everything. In 1996, the U.S. passed a bill that made it much easier to deport immigrants, even for petty crimes. Thousands of gang members, now battle-tested in American streets, were packed onto planes and dropped back into a country that barely had police, let alone a plan. El Salvador was still picking up pieces from its civil war. It wasn't ready for what was coming, and what came was strategy, discipline, and organization. These deported young men were trained, structured, and ruthless. MS-13 and Barrio 18 spread fast, setting up shop in places like San Salvador and Soyapango. Their pitch to poor kids was about money, respect, and protection. Everything the government wasn't offering. By 2011, the country was choking. The murder rate had soared to 71 per 100,000, and the gangs were running the system. They ran extortion rackets so brutal they had names like La Renta, refuse to pay, and you might not make it home. This made the government to reply, but did it change much? Let's find out. Government response to gang control in El Salvador. The government's answer was brutal. This led to mass arrests and tough-on-crime speeches. Beginning in 2003 under President Francisco Flores, he initiated the plan Mano Dura, or Iron Fist approach. This swept through the country and involved increased police presence, stricter laws, and a focus on arresting and imprisoning gang members. By 2011, over 43,000 suspected gang members had been tossed into overcrowded prisons. But the plan backfired. Inside those prison walls, gang leaders weren't silenced. Instead, they were organizing. Cell blocks turned into command centers. Phones were smuggled in, orders went out, and the violence never stopped. This will lead the government to try something else, a deal. In 2012, President Mauricio Funes brokered a secret truce with the gangs. They were promised better prison conditions in exchange for fewer killings, and for a moment, it worked. On April 14th, not a single person was murdered. This day was a result of a gang truce that was brokered between the government, the Catholic Church, and the two largest gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18. Before the truce, El Salvador was experiencing an average of 16 killings per day. The truce, which lasted from March 2012 to May 2014, led to a dramatic drop in homicides. But peace that's bought is peace on borrowed time. The public was furious. How could a government negotiate with killers? When the promises started breaking down, so did the truce. By 2014, the handshake had turned into a fist. The violence roared back with a vengeance. By 2015, the murder rate hit 103 per 100,000 persons, which translates to over 6,600 lives gone in a single year. People were trapped. Businesses collapsed under threats, and families were too afraid to send their kids to school. El Salvador needed something different, not another plan, but this time, a person, someone bold enough to fight fire with fire and clever enough to win public trust while doing it. That someone was Nayib Bukele, and he didn't just promise a new El Salvador. He bulldozed his way into building it. Bukele's rise to power. Reshape. That's exactly what Nayib Bukele set out to do. He didn't want to just tweak the system, not patch it up, but flip it upside down and rebuild it from scratch. And somehow, a dropout turned ad man would become the face of that revolution. But how did this happen? Bukele wasn't raised in the streets. He was raised in a well-off San Salvador home, the son of a wealthy Palestinian businessman and a Catholic mother from the country's east. His dad, Armando Bukele, ran advertising agencies and community projects, giving young Nayib a front-row seat to the power of image, message, and momentum. He started law school at Central American University in 1999 and quit just as fast. By the time most students were cramming for exams, Bukele was already running his own advertisement agency. He didn't just study influence, he sold it. But the real sale was hope. In 2012, at just 30, Bukele made his first political move. Backed by the former guerrilla group-turned-political party FMLN, he ran for mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán, a sleepy coffee town. And he won. He also won the hearts of many. Instead of just making speeches, he made headlines, donating his salary for scholarships and building programs to keep kids away from gangs. He had style, swagger, and a sharp tongue. And in 2015, he took the big step, mayor of San Salvador, the capital and gang central. While others kept their heads down, Bukele made moves. He cleaned up downtown, built open spaces, and launched a culture of peace campaign. He looked like the guy who might actually pull the country out of the fire. But behind the scenes, tension brewed. Will President Bukele's peace campaign be the much-needed change? The power play that changed everything. Bukele didn't play nice with party bosses as he criticized corruption openly. Then came the moment everyone remembers, October 2017, he was expelled from the FMLN after reportedly throwing an apple at a councilwoman he called a witch. His political career should have ended there, but it didn't. He built a party called Nuevas Ideas. But when officials blocked its registration, Bukele didn't blink. He jumped to Ghana, a smaller right-wing party, and launched a presidential run in June 2018. On February 3, 2019, Bukele crushed the old order. With 53% of the vote, he swept aside decades of power held by the FMLN and ARENA. He became the youngest president in El Salvador's history, and the first in nearly 30 years not tied to either major party. But getting elected was just the beginning. On June 20, 2019, he launched the Territorial Control Plan, deploying 10,000 troops and cops into gang-infested zones like Soyapango. It was a muscle flex, but his push hit a wall. With Congress still in the hands of his rivals, they refused to back his plan. On February 7, 2020, they blocked a $109 million loan for the next phase, accusing Bukele of shady gang deals, though nothing was ever proven. But Bukele will go on to respond in a way that sends shockwaves throughout the Americas. He showed up with 40 soldiers. On February 9, 2020, in what would be known as 9F, Bukele marched into Congress with military escorts and sat in the speaker's chair like a man seizing destiny. Supporters roared, critics panicked, and it was no longer just politics, but power theater. And then came the real shift. On May 1, 2021, Bukele's party swept the legislature, winning a supermajority. Suddenly, nothing could stop him. The courts, the Congress became his. With a single vote, he could push through anything. And for a country running on fear and frustration, this victory hit like lightning. By March 2022, the stage was set. El Salvador had a leader with total control, a nation on edge, and a weekend of blood that pushed everything to the brink. And with the country still counting bodies, Bukele made a move that would stun the world and silence the gangs. If you're finding this story as gripping as the rise itself, go ahead and hit the like button. It helps more people discover what really happened. The machine of mass arrests. March 2022 turned the bloodiest chapter in El Salvador's gang crisis. Over 3 terrifying days, 87 people were murdered in cold blood. There were no warnings, no patterns, rather just body after body dropping in cities like San Salvador, Santa Ana, and Soyapango. But on March 27th, President Bukele sent his own message, louder, bolder, and backed by power. He demanded a state of emergency, and the Congress didn't blink. In a matter of hours, the rules changed. El Salvador, a nation of just over 6 million, was now in lockdown mode, and the hunt began. By April 14th, more than 10,000 people had been arrested. Soldiers and police poured into neighborhoods like a wave that never receded. Streets turned into checkpoints, and every alley, every doorway, every look became suspicious. Young men were dragged from their homes, some with criminal ties, others caught in the wrong place wearing the wrong thing, or just having a tattoo on their body. This became a machine of mass arrests powered by fear, rage, and cold efficiency. And it didn't slow down. By the end of 2022, 60,000 people were locked up. By December 2024, that number hit 85,000. That's over 2% of the country's adult population. Temporary holding centers overflowed, and a brand new mega prison was built just to handle the crush of suspected gang members. But here's the thing, on the surface, it worked. Homicides dropped fast. In 2022, killings were cut in half. By 2023, they dropped another 70%. For the first time in years, markets reopened without gang taxes, parents let their kids play outside again, and streets that once belonged to killers felt normal. Also, the homicide rate decreased to 1.9 homicides per 100,000 in 2024, one of the lowest in the Americas. Bukele's approval ratings went sky high. and to many, he was the man who finally cleaned up the mess everyone else had ignored. But behind the numbers, cracks were spreading. Only a small percentage of the arrested had been convicted. The rest? Stuck in limbo with no trials, no answers, and just cells. Stories of abuse surfaced. People were cut off from their families for months, and still, the state of emergency stayed in place. Outside detention centers, families waited in the sun, clutching papers and hope. Hoping for news or justice, but the question kept growing louder. When a government arrests over 69,000 gang members, where are they kept, and how are they kept in check? The mega prison, a fortress built for control. By July 2022, El Salvador's prisons were overcrowded as cells meant for a handful of men held dozens. Temporary detention centers were jammed wall to wall, and these weren't just any prisoners. Many were gang members or suspected gang members from the 85,000 arrests triggered by Bukele's iron-fisted crackdown. But stacking bodies on top of bodies wasn't an option anymore. The older prisons had become command centers, where gang leaders issued orders through smuggled phones and backdoor deals. The government needed something different, something impenetrable. So they built a monster. On June 1st, 2022, deep in the remote town of Tecoluca, 46 miles from San Salvador, construction began on a prison like no other. Its name, the Terrorism Confinement Center, or as the world would come to know it, CECOT. The plan was clear: to build a prison that ensured total control, no leaks, no messages, no outside influence, just walls, locks, guards, and silence. 3 private firms were brought in. They worked non-stop, and in just 7 months, El Salvador unveiled what it claimed was the biggest and most secure prison in the Americas, built for up to 40,000 inmates. The prison stretches across 57 acres of concrete, surrounded by 346 acres of restricted land. There was no room for escape. 2 massive walls, each one 36 feet tall and over 6 feet thick, wrap around the facility like a vice. Between them were electrified fences. Outside, 19 guard towers, each packed with high-tech surveillance, manned by officers handpicked and trained by Bukele's top security teams. Even cell phones didn't stand a chance. A signal jammer cuts off communication within a 1-mile radius. Inside these walls, nothing gets out. And for inmates, nothing gets in. In February 2023, Bukele posted a picture on X of himself and members of his cabinet touring the prison. It is staffed by 250 police officers and 600 soldiers, and covers 410 acres. Bukele posted a video of the transfer of the prison's first 2,000 prisoners, and posted a similar video the following month of the transfer of 2,000 more prisoners. But what's inside is even more extreme. By December 2024, CECOT held over 24,000 inmates. The setup is brutal. 8 massive pavilions. Each cell, roughly the size of a small classroom, holds up to 100 men stacked in metal bunks, 4 tiers high. There are no mattresses, no pillows, and no daylight. Just a few vents near the ceiling and constant heat that pushes past 35 degrees Celsius. Also were 2 cement basins for washing, 2 open toilets, and 1 plastic bucket for drinking water. Meals? Twice a day, usually rice, beans, maybe eggs. Power never cuts out thanks to backup generators. And when the guards slide food trays through small hatches, there's no eye contact, and no words are said. Doors stay locked, and guards in body armor walk the halls. The only break inmates get? 30 minutes in a narrow hallway for group exercise or government-approved readings. No books from the outside are allowed, no letters, and no visits. Even justice never leaves the building. A courtroom inside CECOT handles trials by video. Inmates never leave the grounds. Guards dine in a separate hall while a small medical wing offers only the basics. Still, as the prison filled and the silence deepened, unease grew. What exactly had Bukele built? A solution to chaos, or something darker? But behind those falling crime stats, whispers were getting louder, whispers of secret deals that could rewrite the entire story. If this left you stunned, share it with a friend. Let them see what's really going on behind those walls. Secret pacts or opposition smears. What if the man claiming to crush gangs was cutting deals behind closed doors? From the moment Nayib Bukele stepped into office in 2019, whispers followed him, loud enough to rattle Washington, sharp enough to divide his own country. The gangs were retreating, yes. The murder rate was dropping, sure. But the speed, the precision, the sudden silence of the streets, it all raised a question no one could ignore. Did Bukele outsmart the gangs or shake their hands in the dark? He came into power on June 1st, 2019, facing a Congress dominated by old enemies, FMLN and Arena, two parties with decades of baggage and no intention of making his job easy. His territorial control plan promised to flood gang-controlled areas with 10,000 boots on the ground. It wasn't just a show of force. Phase 2 of the plan aimed to offer jobs, education, and hope to at-risk youth. But that required funding, loans came, and the Congress said no. Then came the accusations. On February 7, 2020, opposition lawmakers claimed Bukele's government was secretly negotiating with MS-13 and Barrio 18. The goal? Lower homicide numbers in exchange for political support. They had no hard proof, but the noise was loud enough to catch international ears. By December of that year, the U.S. pulled financial support from Bukele's government, redirecting it to NGOs, leaving his plans hanging by a thread. And then El Faro stepped in. The Salvadoran news outlet published explosive reports, first in 2020, then again in 2025. Their sources? Alleged gang insiders, names like El Charlie and Liro Man, claimed the government offered cash, special meals, even family visits to gang leaders in exchange for a ceasefire. Some even fled the country under mysterious circumstances, supposedly with help from officials. And then came the U.S. Treasury. On December 8, 2021, they sanctioned two of Bukele's close aides, Carlos Marroquin and Osiris Luna Meza, for allegedly brokering backroom deals with gangs during secret prison meetings in Zacatecoluca. Still, Bukele held the line. He denied everything. There are no deals and no pacts. And here's the kicker. Despite all the noise, no gang leader inside CICOT has come forward to confirm these deals, not one. And with most serving 20 to 40 years, they've got nothing to lose by speaking up. On May 1st, 2021, Bukele's party, Nuevas Ideas, swept Congress, grabbing 56 out of 84 seats. It was game over for the old guard. From that point on, Bukele had the power to extend his crackdown, and he did 37 times. And the numbers, they're impossible to ignore. By January 2024, El Salvador's homicide rate had dropped to just 1.9 per 100,000, a staggering fall from 103 in 2015. Extortion fell by a large number too, and all this happened with zero U.S. aid. To many, it looked like Bukele didn't just win the war, he rewrote the rulebook. But the smoke hasn't cleared. The arrests, the silence from inside CICOT, the blacklisted aides. Is it all just the fallout of real reform? Or did Bukele make a deal with the devil and walk away clean? For now, the truth sits somewhere in the shadows. But Bukele? He's already on to the next move, and this one crossed borders. Because just as El Salvador's prisons filled up, a wave of deportations from the U.S. was heading straight for Bukele's doorstep. Trump's deportees, caught in Bukele's grip. On February 4, 2025, President Nayib Bukele tweeted, "We have offered the United States of America the opportunity to outsource part of its prison system. We are willing to take in only convicted criminals, including convicted U.S. citizens, into our mega prison, CECOT, in exchange for a fee. The fee would be relatively low for the U.S. but significant for us, making our entire prison system sustainable." On March 15, 2025, 238 men landed in El Salvador in chains, heads shaved, wrists bound, dumped into Bukele's mega prison as if they were cartel bosses. But behind the tough optics was a mess of legal confusion, human error, and political theater. By the next day, President Bukele posted a video showing how they received the 238 members of the Venezuelan criminal organization Tren de Aragua. The deportation was fast and quiet. 3 planes took off from Texas, filled with mostly Venezuelans and 23 Salvadorans, all allegedly tied to gangs. The operation was greenlit after a behind-closed-doors meeting between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and President Bukele. Bukele's prison fortress, El Salvador, reportedly received a $6 million deal, though Bukele's office later walked it back to less than $5 million. On March 16th, a federal judge in Washington, D.C., issued an emergency order to stop the deportations, calling out violations of due process. But by then, it was too late. The planes had already landed and the prisoners had already been processed. The law had been outrun by jet engines. And inside CICOT, that's where the real story begins. The human cost of a political deal. The deportees were shoved into Module 8, separated from local inmates but still faced harsh conditions. Cells measured just a few square feet per person. 2 open toilets, 1 plastic bucket to bathe. There are no windows, no letters, and no visitors. For 23.5 hours a day, they are in silence and concrete. Reports from Human Rights Watch and Cristosal painted the same picture: overcrowding, extreme heat, and no oversight. International watchdogs were kept out. The facility was a fortress and a mystery. One man, Kilmar again, was eventually transferred to a lower security center in Santa Ana. When Senator Chris Van Hollen visited him on April 17, 2025, Kilmar looked terrified, isolated, unsure of where he was or what would happen next. He wasn't the only one. By now, the backlash was global. On April 7, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the deportations unconstitutional. Every person, the court said, deserves a chance to fight for their case. The idea of shipping people, some innocent, some undocumented, some just unlucky, into a foreign prison without trial was called what it was: un-American. But Trump wasn't apologizing. In a press conference just a week later, he stood beside Bukele at the White House and called him one hell of a president. Then, in a moment that made headlines, he casually floated the idea of sending U.S. citizens to CECOT. Legal scholars were stunned. El Salvador didn't exactly cheer either. Bukele, careful not to bite the hand feeding him, made one thing clear: El Salvador would only accept convicted criminals. He didn't want his country turned into America's trash bin. But the truth was messy. There was no clear evidence that most of these deportees had done anything wrong. And now they were stuck inside one of the world's harshest prisons. For the families left behind in the U.S., the silence was the worst part. No phone calls, no legal updates, no way to know if their sons or brothers were still alive. This wasn't just a story about deportation. It was about power, politics, and 2 presidents willing to trade human lives like poker chips. And it raised a sharp, uncomfortable question. Was this brutal strategy something the world should fear or copy? Because now, other leaders are watching and wondering if Bukele's playbook could be their own. To keep following stories like this, hit subscribe and stay in the loop as this global playbook unfolds. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.